Let me share something that can change the direction of a life in a single day. Not a new habit, not a productivity system, not a secret strategy, just a few powerful emotions that, when fully felt, can break years of stagnation and create movement where there was once paralysis. Most people believe change happens gradually, and often it does, but the biggest turning points usually begin in a moment when something inside finally shifts, a moment when a person can no longer tolerate what they once accepted, a moment when the mind sees reality clearly and decides it can no longer remain the same. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew that circumstances rarely transform a person overnight, but a new way of seeing those circumstances can. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that life is shaped not only by what happens, but by the judgments we make about what happens. That is why some of the most important changes are invisible at first. They begin long before the world notices them. They begin in thought, in perspective, in the quiet decision to stop living the same way. What makes these moments so powerful is that they rarely look dramatic from the outside. Nothing seems different. The same room, the same responsibilities, the same circumstances, yet internally a line has been crossed. An old excuse loses its power. A new standard is set. A decision is made that cannot easily be undone, and from that moment forward, a different future begins to unfold. Think about how many people spend years waiting for the perfect opportunity. They wait for motivation. They wait for confidence. They wait for circumstances to improve. They tell themselves that once everything feels right, they will finally begin. Yet months pass, sometimes years. The strange thing is that the future they are waiting for never arrives in the form they imagined. Life rarely pauses long enough for perfect conditions to arrive. There is always another obstacle, another uncertainty, another reason to postpone action. Meanwhile, the habits that created the current situation quietly continue. The same thoughts are repeated, the same excuses are rehearsed, the same routines remain untouched. From the outside, it may seem as though nothing is happening, but time is moving, and every day spent waiting becomes another day invested in the very life a person claims they want to leave behind. This is why the ancient Stoics placed so much importance on seeing reality clearly, not the reality shaped by wishful thinking, not the reality softened by comforting stories, reality as it actually exists. They understood that clarity is often uncomfortable because it removes the distance between a person and the truth. As long as something remains vague, it can be ignored. As long as a problem remains undefined, it can be blamed on circumstances. But the moment something becomes clear, responsibility enters the picture. Suddenly, there is nowhere to hide. A person can no longer pretend that their situation is entirely the result of fate, luck, or other people. They begin noticing their own role in maintaining what they dislike. This realization can sting, yet it contains a strange kind of freedom. After all, if your actions helped create the situation, your actions can also help change it. Many people spend enormous amounts of energy protecting themselves from uncomfortable truths, not because they are weak, but because the mind prefers familiar discomfort to unfamiliar change. It clings to what it knows, even when what it knows is holding it back. That is why denial often feels easier than honesty. It allows a person to preserve their current identity. It protects them from the difficult task of admitting that something needs to change. Yet every form of growth begins with the willingness to look directly at what is there. A cluttered room, an unhealthy habit, a neglected goal, a relationship that has been deteriorating for years. The details may differ, but the process remains the same. Transformation begins when explanation gives way to observation, when a person stops arguing with reality and starts studying it. There are moments in life when this confrontation arrives unexpectedly. A person looks around one ordinary afternoon and suddenly notices something they have been overlooking for months. The room they live in no longer feels temporary, it feels symbolic. The unfinished projects scattered around are no longer harmless reminders. They become evidence of avoidance. The promises made at the beginning of the year are no longer motivating thoughts. They become unfinished commitments, staring back in silence. Nothing external has changed, yet everything feels different, because perception has shifted. The mind has stopped filtering reality through excuses. It has started seeing patterns, and once patterns become visible, they are difficult to ignore. The same thing happens in other areas of life. Someone checks their finances and realizes the problem is not a lack of opportunity, but a lack of discipline. Someone reflects on years of frustration and begins noticing that every major setback was followed by the same response: delay, avoidance, rationalization, another promise to start tomorrow, another belief that motivation will eventually appear and make everything easier. Yet tomorrow keeps arriving, disguised as today. The cycle continues because the underlying behavior remains untouched. This is not a pleasant realization. Few truths are. Yet discomfort is often misunderstood. People assume discomfort is a sign that something is wrong. In many cases, discomfort is simply a sign that something important is finally being acknowledged. The Stoics never viewed discomfort as an enemy. They understood that growth and discomfort often travel together. When a person confronts reality honestly, they experience tension because two versions of themselves are colliding. There is the person they imagine themselves to be, and there is the person revealed by their daily actions. The distance between those two versions creates unease, but that unease serves a purpose. It exposes contradictions that would otherwise remain hidden. It forces a person to ask whether their habits truly reflect their values, whether their actions support their goals, whether their current direction leads where they claim they want to go. As Carl Jung observed, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. These reflections are not designed to create guilt. They are designed to create awareness. Awareness changes things quietly at first. No dramatic breakthrough arrives. No sudden transformation appears. Yet a shift begins. A person who has seen clearly cannot return completely to ignorance. They may still procrastinate. They may still struggle. They may still fall into familiar patterns. But something has changed. The excuses no longer sound as convincing as they once did. The rationalizations lose some of their power. The gap between reality and the stories used to explain reality becomes increasingly obvious. This is often where genuine change begins, not with confidence, not with inspiration, but with honesty. And perhaps most importantly, they know they can no longer look away. If ideas like these help bring more clarity to your life, consider subscribing. Not for motivation, but for regular reminders of what truly matters when the noise of everyday life begins to take over. And honesty has a remarkable effect on the human mind. It creates a kind of internal pressure. The pressure does not come from outside expectations or social approval. It comes from knowing. Once a person truly knows what is happening, maintaining the same behavior becomes more difficult. They begin noticing choices they once made automatically. They catch themselves repeating patterns they never questioned before. They become aware of moments when they are drifting away from the person they want to become. This awareness can feel uncomfortable, but it is also evidence that consciousness is expanding. The mind is becoming more attentive, more deliberate, more capable of directing itself. That is why some of the most important moments in life appear completely ordinary. There is no applause, no dramatic breakthrough, no announcement that a transformation has begun. There is simply a quiet realization, a clear look at reality, a decision to stop looking away. And from that moment forward, something fundamental changes. A person may still have a long road ahead of them, but they are no longer lost in illusion. They know where they stand. They know what must be faced. And perhaps most importantly, They know that pretending no longer works. And what do you do when pretending becomes impossible? What do you do when you can no longer convince yourself that tomorrow will somehow be different without changing anything today? This is where many people encounter a kind of internal tension that is difficult to describe. It is not loud. It does not always arrive during a crisis. Sometimes it appears during an ordinary moment when the mind grows tired of repeating the same story. The story that things will improve on their own. The story that more time will somehow create a different outcome. The story that a future version of yourself will possess qualities that the present version refuses to develop. Eventually, something begins to feel dishonest about that narrative. Not because hope is wrong, but because hope without action slowly turns into avoidance. As Epictetus observed, "How long are you going to wait before you demand the best for yourself?" A person starts recognizing the gap between what they intend and what they actually do. And once that gap becomes visible, it is difficult to ignore. Many people assume that difficult decisions are painful because they do not know enough. In reality, they often know far more than they admit. They know which habits are harming them. They know which conversations need to happen. They know which responsibilities have been postponed. The problem is not always a lack of information. Sometimes it is an unwillingness to accept what the information requires. Knowledge carries consequences. Once something becomes clear, action becomes harder to avoid. This is why the mind often searches for additional certainty long after certainty is necessary. It keeps analyzing, it keeps researching, it keeps preparing. Not because preparation is useful, but because preparation feels safer than commitment. The strange thing about endless thinking is that it disguises itself as productivity. A person can spend weeks evaluating possibilities and feel as though they are making progress. They can create plans, compare options, watch videos, read books, and gather advice from countless sources. Yet beneath all of that activity, the essential question remains untouched. Will a decision be made? There comes a point where additional thinking no longer improves clarity. It simply delays action. The mind begins moving in circles rather than forward. Every possibility is explored. Every concern is considered. Every outcome is imagined. Yet nothing changes because the energy that should move into action remains trapped in analysis. This cycle creates a unique kind of exhaustion. Physical work often leaves a person tired but satisfied. Constant indecision creates a different feeling. It drains energy without producing movement. The mind carries the weight of unfinished choices everywhere it goes. In the background, unresolved decisions consume attention. They occupy mental space. They create tension that lingers beneath daily life. A person may not even realize how much energy is being spent maintaining uncertainty until the moment a decision is finally made. Then something surprising happens. Relief arrives. Not because every problem disappears, but because the conflict begins to settle. The mind no longer has to divide itself between countless possibilities. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of commitment. People often focus on what they might lose by choosing. They rarely consider what they gain. A decision creates direction. It gathers scattered energy and points it toward a single destination. Before commitment, attention moves in several directions at once. Part of the mind considers one path. Another part considers a different path. A third part worries about making the wrong choice entirely. The result is fragmentation. Once a decision is made, that fragmentation begins to dissolve. The same energy that was previously spent debating can now be invested in execution. The Stoics understood that certainty is not a prerequisite for action. In fact, certainty is often unavailable. Human beings rarely possess complete knowledge about the future. There will always be risks. There will always be unknowns. Waiting for absolute certainty means waiting forever. Wisdom is not the ability to eliminate uncertainty. Wisdom is the ability to move forward despite it. This shift changes everything because it frees a person from an impossible standard. Instead of demanding perfect confidence before acting, they begin acting with the confidence available to them. Small as it may be, it is enough. As this understanding deepens, something begins to shift internally. The need to control every outcome starts losing its grip. A person becomes less concerned with guaranteeing success and more concerned with acting according to their values. This creates a quieter form of confidence. Not the confidence that everything will work out exactly as planned, but the confidence that whatever happens can be handled. That distinction matters. One depends on external circumstances, the other depends on character. Yet even after making a decision, another challenge appears. You can know exactly what needs to be done and still fail to do it. This confuses many people because they assume knowledge naturally leads to action. They believe that once they understand the solution, change should follow automatically, but experience proves otherwise. People know they should exercise more, yet they remain inactive. They know they should spend less time distracted, yet they continue drifting through hours they never intended to lose. They know they should be more disciplined with money, more consistent with their goals, more intentional with their relationships. The information is already there. The instructions are rarely hidden. The difficulty lies somewhere else. It lies in the distance between knowing and wanting. Because until a person truly wants change, knowledge remains little more than unused potential. This is why desire occupies such an important place in human behavior. Desire is not merely preference. It is not casual interest. It is the force that gives energy to action. Without it, even the best plans struggle to survive. A person may create a detailed strategy, write down goals, and organize every step with precision. Yet none of it matters if the emotional commitment is absent. The mind always finds ways to abandon what it does not genuinely value. Effort becomes inconsistent. Excuses become persuasive. Comfort begins winning small battles that gradually become larger ones. Over time, the original intention fades into the background, not because the goal was impossible, but because the desire behind it was never strong enough to sustain action through difficulty. The interesting thing about desire is that it cannot be forced. No one can simply decide to feel deeply motivated at a specific moment. It does not operate according to commands. It emerges under certain conditions, often unexpectedly. Sometimes it awakens after disappointment. A person works toward something, fails, and suddenly sees their situation with greater clarity than before. Sometimes it arrives during a difficult conversation that reveals truths they have been avoiding. Sometimes it emerges quietly while reflecting on how quickly time has passed. 1 year becomes 5, 5 becomes 10. The future that once seemed distant begins moving closer. The realization is subtle but powerful. Life is not waiting. It continues moving whether a person acts or not. There is a difference between understanding that life is short and feeling it. Most people intellectually accept the idea. They know years pass quickly. They know opportunities do not last forever. Yet knowledge alone rarely changes behavior. Something deeper has to happen. The realization must move beyond thought and enter awareness. It must become personal. A person begins noticing how many moments have already disappeared. They think about plans that were postponed, goals that remained unfinished, conversations that never happened. They see how easily time slips away when left unattended. This awareness does not create panic, at least not the kind that leads to wise action. Instead, it creates seriousness, a quiet recognition that every day carries weight. As this recognition grows, desire begins changing shape. It becomes less dependent on external rewards and more connected to inner standards. The motivation to act is no longer based solely on achieving a specific outcome. It comes from the refusal to waste potential. A person starts caring about who they are becoming through their actions. Progress matters, but character matters more. The goal is no longer simply reaching a destination. The goal becomes living in a way that feels aligned with deeper values. This creates a more stable source of energy because external circumstances are unpredictable. Results may take time. Success may arrive slowly. Yet the ability to act according to one's principles remains available every day. Something else begins to happen when desire reaches this level. Attention changes. The mind starts noticing possibilities that previously went unseen. Not because the world has suddenly transformed, but because perception has shifted. Opportunities often exist long before they are recognized. The difference is that people tend to notice what aligns with their focus. Someone committed to growth sees lessons where others see inconveniences. Someone determined to improve notices resources, connections, and possibilities that were always present. It is similar to buying a specific type of car and suddenly seeing that model everywhere. The cars were already there. Awareness simply changed. This shift can feel almost magical at first, but it is deeply practical. Human attention is selective. It filters enormous amounts of information every day. When desire becomes strong, the mind naturally begins searching for things connected to that desire. Solutions become easier to recognize. Helpful ideas stand out more clearly. Opportunities that once seemed invisible become difficult to ignore. This is not luck. It is the result of directing attention with greater intention. The world has not changed, the observer has. From this perspective, desire becomes far more than an emotion. It becomes a force that organizes perception itself. It influences what receives attention and what gets overlooked. It affects decisions, habits, and daily behavior in ways that often go unnoticed. Without it, even valuable opportunities may pass by unseen. With it, progress begins gaining momentum because the mind is no longer wandering aimlessly. It has a direction, and direction changes everything. Once a person genuinely wants something, their relationship with effort begins to transform. Tasks that once felt burdensome start feeling meaningful. Sacrifices become easier to tolerate because they serve a purpose. Obstacles remain difficult, but they no longer appear pointless. Desire does not eliminate resistance, but it provides a reason to move through it. That reason becomes increasingly important because lasting change rarely depends on what a person knows. It depends on what they care about enough to pursue consistently, even when enthusiasm fades and the work remains. The Stoics understood this deeply. They observed that events do not arrive with fixed meanings attached to them. Meaning is something the mind assigns afterward. This does not mean that pain is imaginary or that difficulties should be ignored. It simply means that between what happens and how a person responds, there is a space. Within that space lies judgment. Two individuals can encounter the same criticism. One carries it for months, replaying every word and allowing it to damage their confidence. The other listens carefully, extracts what is useful, and leaves the rest behind. The criticism itself is identical. The difference exists in the interpretation. That interpretation eventually shapes emotion, behavior, and future decisions. This becomes especially important during difficult periods of life. Most people do not struggle because challenges exist. Challenges are unavoidable. They struggle because they assume challenges should not exist. There is a subtle but significant difference between those two positions. When a person expects life to be free from obstacles, every obstacle feels like evidence that something has gone wrong. Frustration grows quickly, resentment follows, energy that could be used for adaptation becomes consumed by resistance. The mind argues with reality instead of responding to it. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Yet reality rarely changes because it is argued with. It changes because it is understood and addressed. There is a reason some individuals appear remarkably calm during situations that overwhelm others. It is not always because they possess greater strength or intelligence. Often they have developed a different relationship with adversity. They understand that difficulties are not interruptions to life. They are part of life. Because of this, they spend less time wishing reality were different and more time working with the reality that exists. This mindset creates a sense of stability that external circumstances cannot easily disrupt. The world continues changing. Problems continue appearing, yet their attention remains focused on what can actually be influenced rather than what cannot. As this perspective develops, fear begins changing as well. Fear often grows strongest when the mind interprets every obstacle as a threat. Every uncertainty becomes dangerous. Every challenge becomes evidence that something terrible may happen. This creates a habit of avoidance. A person starts shrinking their world in an effort to protect themselves from discomfort. Yet the more they avoid, the smaller their world becomes. The Stoics approached fear differently. They believed that difficulties could be faced, examined, and learned from. By doing so, fear gradually lost some of its authority. It no longer dictated every decision. It became information rather than a command. This does not mean becoming fearless. Fear is a natural part of being human. The goal is not to eliminate it entirely. The goal is to prevent it from controlling the direction of life. When a person learns to view challenges as opportunities for development, fear begins losing its ability to stop forward movement. The obstacle remains visible, but it no longer appears insurmountable. Confidence grows, not because success is guaranteed, but because the individual trusts their ability to handle whatever comes next. That trust becomes increasingly valuable because life rarely offers certainty. It offers opportunities to respond. Over time, this way of seeing the world begins influencing countless areas of life. Criticism becomes feedback. Failure becomes education. Delays become opportunities to develop patience. Unexpected difficulties become chances to strengthen resilience. The events themselves remain unchanged, yet their role in a person's life transforms completely. What once seemed like evidence of limitation begins functioning as a source of growth. This is one of the most practical forms of power available. Not the power to control everything that happens, but the power to decide what those experiences mean. As attention shifts in this direction, a person starts noticing something interesting. The world begins appearing different, even though it has not actually changed. Opportunities seem more abundant. Solutions become easier to recognize. Challenges feel less personal and more manageable. This is not because life suddenly became easier. It is because perception became clearer. The mind stopped treating every difficulty as an enemy and started treating it as part of the path. That distinction matters more than many realize, because perception influences action, and action influences outcomes. This is why so many people remain stuck despite possessing valuable knowledge. They know what should be done. They understand the benefits of consistency. They understand the importance of responsibility. They recognize the habits that are holding them back. Yet knowledge alone does not create movement. As Epictetus observed, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. The mind can understand a truth for years, while behavior remains unchanged. This often creates frustration because people assume understanding should automatically lead to action. When it does not, they begin questioning themselves. They wonder why progress feels so difficult. They search for more information, believing another insight will finally unlock change. Yet the answer is rarely found in acquiring additional knowledge. More often, it is found in applying what is already known. The challenge begins because action carries risk. The moment a person moves beyond thinking and starts doing, uncertainty becomes real. Outcomes are no longer theoretical. Failure becomes possible. Criticism becomes possible. Disappointment becomes possible. As long as an idea remains in the imagination, it cannot be tested. It cannot fail. It remains protected. Action removes that protection. It exposes a person to reality. This is why hesitation often feels safer than movement. Remaining still allows possibilities to remain perfect in the mind. Taking action forces those possibilities into the imperfect world where results are uncertain. The Stoics understood this dynamic well. They never defined courage as the absence of fear. Fear is a natural response to uncertainty. It appears whenever something meaningful is at stake. The presence of fear does not indicate weakness. What matters is how a person responds to it. Courage begins when fear is acknowledged but not obeyed. A difficult conversation still takes place. A necessary decision is still made. An important step is still taken. The emotion remains, yet it no longer determines behavior. This distinction is crucial because many people spend years waiting to feel fearless before acting. They assume confidence must arrive first. In reality, confidence often arrives afterward. Many people underestimate the importance of evidence. The mind pays close attention to behavior. It watches what a person repeatedly does and forms conclusions based on those actions. Someone who consistently avoids challenges begins seeing themselves as someone who avoids challenges. Someone who repeatedly confronts difficulties begins building a different identity. This process happens quietly. There is rarely a dramatic moment when self-perception changes. Instead, it evolves through accumulated experiences. Small actions create evidence. Evidence influences belief. Belief influences future behavior. Gradually, a cycle forms. Whether that cycle strengthens growth or strengthens limitation depends largely on the actions being repeated. This is why seemingly small decisions matter so much. Making a phone call, starting a project, waking up when intended, following through on a commitment. These actions may appear insignificant in isolation, yet their psychological effect is substantial. Each one sends a message. The message is not delivered through words but through behavior. It tells the mind what kind of person is emerging. Consistency strengthens that message. Over time, identity begins aligning with action. A person stops seeing discipline as something they occasionally practice and starts seeing it as part of who they are. There is another benefit to action that often goes unnoticed. Action creates momentum. Momentum changes the emotional experience of progress. When a person remains inactive, every task feels larger than it actually is. The mind magnifies difficulty. It imagines obstacles. It predicts problems. Once movement begins, many of those imagined barriers lose their power. The first step is often the hardest because it requires overcoming inertia. After that, movement tends to create additional movement. One completed task encourages another. One successful effort creates energy for the next. Progress begins generating its own motivation. This explains why waiting for motivation is often ineffective. Motivation is inconsistent. Some days it appears naturally, other days it disappears without warning. Building a life around motivation means building on unstable ground. Action operates differently. Action can occur whether motivation is present or absent. It relies less on emotion and more on commitment. The remarkable thing is that action often produces the very motivation people were waiting for. Energy increases after movement begins. Enthusiasm follows progress. What seemed impossible while sitting still feels manageable once momentum exists. Now something deeper begins to emerge. At first, change often appears to be about goals, habits, or productivity. A person wants to improve their health, advance their career, become more disciplined, or gain greater control over their life. These are worthwhile pursuits, but beneath them lies something even more important. Every action taken consistently begins shaping the relationship a person has with themselves. Every promise that is kept strengthens trust. Every commitment that is honored reinforces reliability. Over time, these moments accumulate into something far more valuable than external achievement. They create self-respect. And while self-respect rarely receives the attention it deserves, it quietly influences nearly every aspect of life. The way a person thinks, speaks, decides, and responds to difficulty is deeply connected to how much they trust their own character. Many people spend years pursuing external validation without realizing what they are truly searching for. They want recognition, approval, status, or accomplishment because they believe these things will finally make them feel secure. Yet countless examples show that external success alone cannot provide lasting confidence. Someone can achieve impressive goals and still feel uncertain inside. They can receive praise and still doubt themselves. They can appear successful to everyone around them while privately feeling disconnected from who they want to be. This happens because confidence built entirely on external factors remains fragile. It depends on circumstances remaining favorable. It depends on results continuing to arrive. It depends on the opinions of other people. The moment those conditions change, the confidence begins to weaken. This foundation becomes increasingly important because life inevitably presents challenges. Difficult days arrive, plans fail, circumstances change unexpectedly. During those moments, external achievements offer limited protection. What matters more is the relationship a person has developed with themselves. Do they trust their ability to respond wisely? Do they believe they can endure discomfort without abandoning their principles? Do they know they can rely on themselves when things become difficult? These questions reveal why self-respect carries such importance. It creates a form of stability that remains available even when external conditions become uncertain. Trusting yourself is not something that happens automatically. It is earned in the same way trust is earned between people. Through consistency, through reliability, through repeated evidence. When someone makes a promise and follows through, trust grows. When they repeatedly break promises, trust weakens. The same principle applies internally. Every commitment made to yourself carries weight. Every time you follow through on something difficult, the mind takes note. Every time you honor a commitment despite inconvenience, another piece of evidence is added. Gradually, a new belief begins forming. The belief that your words can be trusted, that your intentions will be supported by action, that your values are more than ideas. This process is often subtle. It does not usually create dramatic emotional highs. In fact, many of the actions that build self-respect appear ordinary. Waking up when you intended to, completing a task you promised yourself you would finish, remaining honest when dishonesty would be easier, exercising discipline when comfort would be more appealing. These moments rarely attract attention from others. They may not impress anyone, yet internally they are incredibly significant because they strengthen alignment between belief and behavior. The mind stops receiving mixed signals. It begins seeing consistency. As this consistency develops, confidence starts changing its source. It no longer depends entirely on achievements or outcomes. It comes from something quieter and more durable. A person begins feeling secure because they trust their own conduct. They know they can face challenges without immediately giving up. They know they can tolerate discomfort in pursuit of something meaningful. They know that setbacks will not automatically cause them to abandon their principles. This kind of confidence feels different from the confidence often celebrated in modern culture. It is less concerned with appearance and more concerned with substance. Less focused on impressing others and more focused on maintaining integrity. Integrity has a remarkable effect on daily life. It influences how a person carries themselves. It affects the way they communicate. It shapes the decisions they make when nobody is watching. There is a quiet strength that emerges when actions consistently reflect values. It creates clarity because fewer internal conflicts exist. A person no longer needs to spend energy justifying behavior that contradicts their principles. They no longer need elaborate explanations for why they failed to follow through. Their actions speak clearly, and that clarity creates peace. The external world may not immediately notice this transformation. There may be no visible signs at first. The same job may remain, the same environment may remain, the same responsibilities may remain. Yet internally, something significant has changed. The person who once doubted themselves begins developing trust. The person who constantly sought validation begins relying more on character. The person who repeatedly abandoned commitments begins proving their reliability. These shifts are invisible to most observers, but they influence every future decision. Perhaps this is why self-respect is such a powerful form of success. It changes the standard by which life is measured. Instead of constantly asking whether enough has been achieved, a person begins asking whether they are becoming someone they admire. Instead of chasing every source of approval, they focus on maintaining integrity. The result is a deeper sense of confidence that cannot easily be shaken by criticism, setbacks, or changing circumstances. And once a person experiences that kind of internal stability, returning to old patterns becomes increasingly difficult. They have seen what it feels like to trust themselves. They have experienced the quiet strength that comes from alignment between values and actions. And after that, the habits that once seemed acceptable begin feeling far too small for the person they are becoming. Which brings us to the final realization. The life most people hope for is rarely created through a single breakthrough. It is tempting to believe that transformation arrives all at once. A perfect opportunity appears. A powerful realization strikes. Everything changes overnight. Stories built around dramatic turning points are appealing because they simplify the process. They make growth seem sudden and exciting, yet real change usually unfolds in a quieter way. It emerges through repeated decisions that seem insignificant when viewed individually. A person chooses patience instead of impulse, responsibility instead of avoidance, discipline instead of comfort. Nothing extraordinary appears to happen in the moment, yet these choices accumulate. Day after day, they begin shaping a different future. Not because any single decision was life-changing on its own, but because together they create a pattern. Patterns deserve more attention than most people give them. Human lives are largely built from repeated behaviors. What is done consistently matters far more than what is done occasionally. A person may have moments of inspiration, bursts of motivation, or periods of exceptional effort, but lasting results usually depend on what happens when those moments fade. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The ordinary days matter most, the days when no one is watching, the days when progress feels slow, the days when comfort offers an easier alternative. Character reveals itself in those moments, not through grand declarations, but through repeated actions that quietly reinforce a chosen direction. The Stoics understood this principle clearly. They viewed life as a continuous practice rather than a single achievement. Wisdom was not something acquired once and possessed forever. It had to be exercised repeatedly. Discipline was not a personality trait granted to a fortunate few. It was something strengthened through use. Every day presented another opportunity to act according to reason rather than impulse. Another opportunity to choose long-term benefit over short-term comfort. Another opportunity to align actions with values. The challenge was never knowing what mattered. The challenge was remembering to practice it consistently. This is where many people become distracted. They search for secrets. They search for hidden methods, perfect systems, or revolutionary insights that promise dramatic results with minimal effort. The appeal is understandable. Simplicity often feels less exciting than novelty. Repetition rarely receives the same attention as breakthroughs. Yet when examined honestly, most meaningful improvements come from ordinary actions performed consistently over time. Better health emerges from repeated choices. Strong relationships emerge from repeated choices. Financial stability emerges from repeated choices. Inner strength emerges from repeated choices. The process is not mysterious. What makes it difficult is not understanding it. What makes it difficult is committing to it. Part of that difficulty comes from the way the mind naturally operates. It often focuses on distant outcomes while overlooking present actions. People think about where they want to be in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. They imagine future success. They picture future happiness. Yet the future is built from present decisions. The quality of tomorrow depends heavily on what happens today. This does not mean obsessing over every small choice. It means recognizing their cumulative effect. A single decision may seem insignificant. A habit repeated hundreds of times is not insignificant at all. Every action becomes meaningful when viewed through this lens, not because every action is dramatic, but because every action contributes to identity. Human beings become what they repeatedly do. Each decision casts a vote for a particular version of the self. One choice strengthens discipline, another strengthens avoidance. One reinforces patience, another reinforces impulsiveness. These effects may seem small at first, yet they compound over time. Eventually, they become habits. Habits become character. Character influences destiny. The process is gradual, but its impact is profound. This understanding removes much of the pressure people place on themselves regarding the future. There is no need to control the next decade all at once. There is no requirement to solve every problem immediately. Life becomes more manageable when attention returns to what can actually be influenced. The next action, the next response, the next decision. These moments may appear modest, yet they are where change actually occurs. The future is shaped in the present, not someday, not eventually. Here, there is something liberating about this realization. It shifts focus away from circumstances that cannot be controlled and back toward choices that can. A person no longer needs perfect conditions to move forward. They no longer need certainty about every future outcome. What matters is the willingness to act appropriately within the current moment. As Epictetus reminded his students, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Progress becomes less overwhelming because it is no longer measured against distant ideals. It is measured against present responsibility. Over time, these small acts of alignment begin producing visible results. The person who consistently chooses discipline becomes more disciplined. The person who repeatedly acts with integrity becomes more trustworthy. The person who regularly confronts challenges becomes more resilient. None of these transformations occur instantly. They emerge gradually through repetition. Yet their effects are unmistakable. A different life begins taking shape, not because fortune intervened, not because a secret was discovered, but because daily choices steadily built a stronger foundation. Perhaps this is the most important lesson of all. Lasting change is rarely created through extraordinary moments alone. It is created through ordinary moments handled well, through repeated decisions that reflect deeper values, through consistent action taken despite discomfort, uncertainty, or inconvenience. The future remains unwritten, but every choice contributes a sentence. Every habit adds a paragraph. Every day becomes another opportunity to shape the story. And if that is true, then meaningful transformation is never as distant as it appears. It begins wherever you are, with whatever choice comes next, right now, in this moment, in this decision. A different life does not begin when circumstances change. It begins when you do. It begins the moment you stop waiting, stop negotiating with yourself, and start acting in alignment with the person you know you can become. The future is not built all at once. It is built one thought, one choice, and one action at a time. And sooner than most people realize, those small decisions become a completely different life. If this message resonated, Take a moment to continue the journey by watching one of the videos on your screen. The next lesson may be the one idea that stays with you long after today. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, take care of your mind, stay true to your principles, and keep moving forward.